Hi, everyone. Welcome to Activate Your Arts Data. Thank you for joining us. If we haven't met, I'm Patty Harris, and I have the pleasure of leading Bloomberg Philanthropies, which encompasses all of Mike Bloomberg's giving, including Bloomberg Associates, our pro bono consulting arm, which works closely with cities around the world. Along Kate Levin, who runs all of our cultural and arts programs, I'm thrilled to have such a great group here today for this event. We're thrilled. We're joined by hundreds of partners from local arts agencies and nonprofits, leaders from state governments and the federal government, as well as educators, artists, and more. I think it's safe to assume that most of us are here because we're passionate about the arts, but also because it's okay, we can admit it, we love data. You know, our founder, Mike Bloomberg, is a big data guy, and he loves the arts too. They've always been a major focus for us at Bloomberg Philanthropies because we know the incredibly positive impact they have on cities. We've seen it here in New York and globally. Data has always been a big part of our work, and because to win public support for the arts, it's critical to show all the benefits they offer, and that includes community benefits, social benefits, and economic benefits. Now, of course, the ultimate value of arts and culture cannot be quantified. There's no silver bullet arts metric, and we're not counting trash pickups or carbon emissions. But the more we can quantify some of the benefits of the arts in a meaningful way, the more we can communicate its impact, not just on individual hearts and minds, but also its impact as a public service. That's something that I've seen firsthand, serving on different cultural boards over the years and also working at City Hall for a very long time. For example, when we were at City Hall, we talked about the Bronx Zoo as a smart cultural investment, not only because of the quality and excitement of the organization, but also given all of the revenue it generates. In fact, in a State of the City speech once, Mayor Bloomberg cited how the zoo brought more than 400,000 hot dogs and hamburgers from local suppliers in one single year. Like I said, we're all about the data. We also quantified the economic impact of the Gates in Central Park, which was a major temporary public art installation by Christo and Jean-Claude, which catalyzed more than $250 million in economic activity. And this data point made a huge difference in explaining the project's impact in New York City, but also encouraging more exciting public art here in New York. Now, as we've worked with more cities, we've seen a growing desire for better data about their local creative sectors. And there seems to be limited guidance on how to collect arts data and how to make the most of it to understand the needs of the field, garner additional support, and address goals of equity and inclusion. The more that advocates have access to good data and know how to use it effectively, the more successful they'll be in ensuring the arts play an even greater role in shaping civic policies and budgets. To help meet this need, our team has produced an amazing and original guide called, fittingly, Arts Data in the Public Sector. In it, you'll find case studies analyzing census data, capital funding, and more. Overall, the guide highlights data-driven practices from 15 local arts agencies across the country. We hope these practices spread to even more localities, especially as they rebuild from COVID and focus on equitable access to the arts across all communities. Today, I'm very excited to introduce my colleagues, Tracy Knuckles and David Anderson, who will share more from the guide and some of its valuable takeaways. We're also so pleased to hear directly from leaders at two of the guide's featured agencies in Los Angeles, California, and Charlotte, North Carolina. First, though, I want to bring in Michael Orlov from the National Endowment for the Arts. We're so pleased to have him with us. Michael leads the NEA's state, regional, and local partnerships, and he's been deeply involved in their American Rescue Plan grants for local arts agencies. That effort and this event today are all about supporting creative communities, and we couldn't ask for a better partner in that work than the NEA. Again, thank you so much for being here. Michael, thank you so much for your leadership, and now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Patty. What a privilege to be here with so many of our local arts agency colleagues throughout the country And knowing that there are over 500 plus LAAs represented on this webinar is so encouraging. Let me first recognize my colleague, Lara Holman-Garitano, the NEA's local arts agency specialist, for her tireless work in the field, and Sunil Iyengar, our research director, for making the initial introduction to David, Tracy, and Bloomberg Associates. We are ecstatic to see the sophisticated set of data and learning tools being developed for the field, and we hope this is just the beginning. Early on in this administration, we arranged for a series of listening sessions with a number of our regional, state, and local partners. Really just an opportunity for our new political team to better understand what is happening out in the field, specifically within the partnership portfolio. They were incredibly informative for all of us, but one comment really stuck out for me. It came from our colleague, Tariana Navas-Nieves, Director of Denver Cultural Affairs, as she plainly asked how the National Endowment for the Arts can best support efforts of the local arts agencies, quote, given their privilege of proximity and trust in their communities, end quote. That really resonated with me and with everyone on the call, as it underscores the important role LAAs play in their community, but also the importance of the relationship between the National Endowment for the Arts and our local arts agency partners. And this has been made even more evident over the past couple of years in the face of a global pandemic and social unrest. Our LAA partners have demonstrated their ability to serve their communities based not only on understanding of needs, but also the strength to adapt and position the creative sector and their agency to best serve those needs. So this Bloomberg report comes at such a pivotal moment where critical decisions are being made at the federal, state, and certainly the local level. There's been so much published about rebuilding and reformative arts-based work these past couple of years, and all signs point to the local level as the place where real change, transformation, and innovation begins. Sunil Iyengar penned a blog post last fall that touched on the importance of our local partners, referencing them as agents for recovery. And I'll pop that in the chat in a minute, which leads me to the American Rescue Plan, where our agency made a conscious decision to support LAAs within the framework of our allocation, as we certainly see some of our agents for recovery, borrowing from Sunil's blog post, to be our local arts agency partners. We couldn't be more excited about the landmark investment we made, $20.2 million to be exact, in ARP local subgranting, and can't wait to see the impact those dollars will have nationwide. Before I close, I want to lift up a couple of agency announcements. First and foremost, Dr. Maria Rosario Jackson just started her tenure on Tuesday as the 13th chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, and we couldn't be more excited. You will hear more from her soon, but we'll put her very first correspondence shared via our website in the chat. And on the research side, the NEA just posted a new 5-year research agenda, which puts a premium on the development of new data sets and tools to help arts and cultural policymakers and practitioners, including local arts agencies. Under new guidelines released this month, organizations may apply to the NEA's research grants program to develop, test, and evaluate such resources. And I'll throw those in the chat as well. And finally, next month, we expect to release a new strategic plan for the agency. In this plan, the NEA proposes to build capacity and infrastructure within the arts sector through knowledge sharing, tools, resources, and evidence-based practices. So the Bloomberg Guide is very much in the spirit of this endeavor. Thanks again to all of our colleagues at Bloomberg Associates for bringing us together around this important study, and I'm hopeful that this may allow us to all work more closely together in the coming years. I would now like to pass the microphone to David Anderson at Bloomberg Associates.
Thanks, Michael, and hi, everybody. I'm David Anderson on the culture team at Bloomberg Associates, and I'm excited to share some highlights from our guide. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping items. We have the chat box open, so feel free to use that to ask questions. We'll save time for some Q&A at the end. We're also recording this webinar, and we'll share a link to the recording following the webinar in an email. And Lastly, we'll also drop a link to download the guide PDF in the chat if you haven't done so already. And we'll also share a link where you can request a print copy of the guide. Next slide, please. So this report really came directly out of our practice at Bloomberg Associates, consulting with city arts agencies around the country and internationally. A request that we've gotten from a number of our client cities is for help revamping their grant applications and final reports to collect better data and for strategies for using that data effectively. This work echoes my team's own experience with data-driven arts policymaking, working for the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs during the Bloomberg administration. Cracking the arts data nut has only become more pressing as cities increasingly use data in deciding where to allocate resources, even more so as we look toward pandemic recovery and building a more equitable and inclusive future. So, seeing this widespread interest in this topic, we undertook extensive sector research and did deep dives into 15 agencies, including materials review and interviews with staff and leadership. And we pulled out themes, strategies, and some great case studies into this guide. Next slide. In our conversations, everyone acknowledged some key challenges with arts data that really flow through all of the data strategies that we highlight in this guide. So first, counting what counts. If you try to force the arts into a series of numbers, aren't you losing its real value? Next, how can you find a uniform for unicorns? I was very happy with that phrase. There are so many different kinds of creative activities. How can you really standardize them so that you can have a meaningful comparison? Next, regarding resources, is it really worth the staff and budget resources to spend time on data analysis rather than time directly supporting arts groups? And lastly, making the case. What happens if we don't have any data to show off all of the many impacts we all know that the arts can have? Will government have a hard time justifying allocating resources to the arts that could otherwise be used for other public services with clearer impact data? The general sentiment among the folks that we spoke to is ultimately, okay, arts data can be tricky, but there are things you can count. And if done thoughtfully, engaging with data can help you better serve the field and ultimately help you ensure that the arts don't get left behind. Next slide. For the agencies we interviewed, a big driver of their data priorities was really what's nice versus what's necessary. And this relates both to the time and resources of agency staff themselves, but even more importantly, the time and resources of the artists and arts organizations who are providing that data. In practice, the main ways that we found agencies to use their data were for compliance. So as a government agency, what data do you need to responsibly issue public funding? For field knowledge, what data gives you and others an understanding of the sector and its needs? For advocacy, what data can help you make the case for culture alongside other civic priorities? And for equity, what data can help you assess your reach and any gaps in service? Next slide. So the first half of this guide shares the most useful patterns that we saw across agencies. We divided these best practices into 4 subject areas, looking at how agencies collect the data and that they can really use, how they interpret the raw data into meaningful analyses, how they respond to the findings, using them to inform their program strategy, and how they share the data beyond the agency. We won't have enough time to go into all or even most of the specific practices covered in the guide, but I'll give a highlight from each of these subject areas. Next slide, please. For most agencies, the main goal when collecting data is to ask for what you really need and figure out how to collect it efficiently and in a format that will make it easy for you to analyze. One example I really like relates to collecting data for mapping purposes. So most government agencies collect the mailing addresses of their grantees for legal purposes. So it's easy to make a map of those. But if the grantee is, say, a music group that performs at different venues across the city, their mailing address might just be a PO box or their executive director's apartment. So a map of those doesn't really give you a good sense of where funded programming actually took place in the city. Some agencies have developed tools to collect addresses of all of the program venues to make a better map of where arts activities are taking place. And you'll see an example here on the left from Nashville Metro Arts. It's a spreadsheet where they collect all of the program addresses from each grantee, as well as a few other pieces of information about each site, like the number of occurrences, the number of participants. In some cases, agencies will collect the type of facility. And then on the right, you can see sample maps from Philadelphia. The left map, they're pretty small, but really you can get the point across of the difference between these two. The left map just shows administrative locations in green dots, and the right map has program locations added in purple, showing that the agency has a much broader reach across the city that the left map wouldn't really have captured. And then you can always layer on additional data about the number of participants or type of facility or whatever you collect, and you can get an even more nuanced picture of where programming is taking place. Next slide. So this should never be data for the sake of data. It's all about what you do with it. When you're approaching data analysis, it's often best to reverse engineer what you're trying to find out. One interesting strategy we've seen in a number of places is to conduct a baseline analysis of grantee data and then overlay complementary data that helps you dig deeper into a specific issue that you're trying to assess. One great example involves assessing community reach, and you can see it here. So the LA County Department of Arts and Culture, we'll hear from a couple colleagues there later on in this webinar, created a pilot grant program that focused on arts activities in non-traditional venues. They then compared this pilot grant program to their flagship grant program, looking at the zip codes where grantees in each of the two programs worked across the city. They then overlaid census data about the racial and socioeconomic makeups of those zip codes where the grantees were working. And they discovered that the new grant program actually better served low-income areas and areas with majority people of color than the flagship grant program did. These findings helped them make the case to the County Board of Supervisors to increase the funding for the new program and ultimately to make it a permanent program of the agency. Next slide. So once you have the findings from your data, what do you do with them? LA, for example, used its findings to advocate for more funding. There are tons of other great examples in the guide of how agencies use their findings to improve equitable access to the arts in their cities through targeted outreach and technical assistance, through adjusting eligibility criteria and scoring rubrics, or even through designing a whole new funding stream that targets underserved communities. And in a minute, we'll actually hear more from one case study in Charlotte, North Carolina, that created a new funding stream. In one nice example here on this slide of an outreach strategy, the San Francisco Arts Commission assessed grantee data and determined that certain groups were underrepresented in the grantee pool as compared to city census figures. They then hired community ambassadors to do targeted outreach and offer one-on-one technical assistance to potential applicants from underrepresented groups. An example outcome is that in the first year, the percentage of Latinx grantees grew from 4% of the pool to 14%, which was almost at the 15% citywide census figure. Next slide. Lastly, what are the most effective ways to share your data in a digestible format? And what context do you need to provide so that your data isn't misrepresented? Maps, for example, can be super useful tools for grantees and elected officials to know what else is happening in their neighborhoods. And there are increasingly better mapping platforms out there. Even Google Maps lets you import a spreadsheet of addresses and will create a simple map for you for free. A nice example here in Seattle is a dashboard that the agency created for their annual report that includes an interactive map of all their grantees coded by type. So all of these examples that I've shown are just some of the strategies we highlight in the guide. There are a lot of different ways that agencies tackle these areas, and some may be right for you and some may not. Next slide. The second half of the guide is a deeper dive into the specific data categories commonly collected by arts agencies. We organize them into 5 subject areas. So general information about the organization, workforce information about staff, board, artists, programming information, locations, as we discussed, administrative and programmatic, and demographics, both of workforce and artists, and also of program participants. We include commonly collected data points for each of these categories, as well as specific considerations and collection tips. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I will spend a moment on demographics. Next slide. So demographics is, in many ways, the holy grail of data for many government services, because it can really help you understand who you're reaching and who you aren't. But it's also some of the most challenging to get. There is so much complexity when collecting demographic data about individuals. We saw this across all of the agencies we studied, who grappled with how to collect this data responsibly without invading people's privacy, without taking an inordinate amount of time and resources, but also without guesstimating, which a lot of people do and can be problematic. But people are increasingly making efforts here using anonymized EEO records, using geography as a proxy, or other ways of framing this data, several of which we highlight in the guide. It's all about finding that sweet spot that gets you usable data in the most realistic and responsible way. Next slide. So here is our data categories chart. It's teeny tiny on the slide and hard to read, but basically the 15 agencies are listed across the top. Specific data points are listed down the side, organized into those 5 categories. And an orange dot indicates that an agency collects that particular data point. I wanted to include this because it gives you an overall sense of how there are some similarities and some differences in how agencies approach what data to collect, which really isn't surprising. This is a field all about difference, and there's no one data prescription. Part of what we hope the guide will be helpful with is showing the spectrum of practice. For example, here, the bottom chunk you'll see is all about demographics, and it's all over the place. Nobody's figured out the perfect solution yet, but it's really figuring out what works best for you and your community. Next slide, please. So this is an ongoing conversation. We would love nothing more than to update this report as terrific new strategies come into play. You can visit our website or email us, and please keep us in the loop if we've missed anything, or if you find great new examples of innovative ways to activate your arts data. We'd love to keep this conversation going. So now I will pass it along to my colleague, Ebony Lewis, the Program Director for Culture Blocks at the Arts and Science Council of Charlotte, North Carolina. It's all you, Ebony.
Thank you so much, David. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited to be here to share with you all about this wonderful program, Culture Blocks. Culture Blocks, as you see, is actually rooted in listening, learning, and responding. And this really speaks to how we use and how data was used to create this program to meet the needs of our neighbors and the residents across Mecklenburg County here in Charlotte, North Carolina area. Next slide. So in 2013, a quality of life survey was done for Mecklenburg County, and it looked at a few different indicators. One of those was cultural interactions and experiences. And for the purpose of this study, cultural interactions and experiences were defined as people who had participation by way of purchasing tickets, were members to or were donors for organizations that received operating support funding from the Arts and Science Council at that time. And as you can see on the slide, 15% of the households across the county had participation or interactions with these organizations. If you'll notice the different shading of colors, you will see like darker blue areas in the center of the map as well as to the north of the map. And this actually aligns with several other indicators across the county as it relates to socioeconomics and education. And it is often referred to in discussions here as the crescent and the wedge. And so the county then came to the Arts and Science Council to try to figure out why the map looked the way that it did, as well as to maybe figure out ways to change the way that the map looked. Next slide. So the Culture Blocks program was rooted in the perspective of meeting the needs of our neighbors. And I often use the word neighbors to refer to residents because neighbors just has more of a community feel. And so in terms of meeting the needs of our neighbors, to understand why the map looked the way that it did, to find out how the changes could be made and what could be done so that everyone across the county could have cultural interactions and experiences. And as we all know in the arts community, just because the map looked the way that it did not mean that art did not exist throughout the entire county. But by way of finding out the answers to some of those questions, the program was birthed. And so one of the reasons why people decided to participate might be due to socioeconomics, but there are other factors. So as you see here on the slide, transportation, so maybe not being able to access some of the locations and facilities where programs are taking place. Lack of representation due to what was or wasn't on the walls in museums or on stages, or even time of day. So for some of our neighbors who maybe have an earlier bedtime, an 8 p.m. Performance might not be of interest to them. The program is funded by Mecklenburg County, and as a result, there's a community partnership with the Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation Center and the libraries, because these are spaces in facilities in neighborhoods across the county. One of the reasons why people expressed a lack of desire to participate in experiences was just due to lack of maybe feeling comfort in certain spaces, not wanting to travel outside of their community. And so these are spaces and facilities that are already where residents live, that people feel comfortable. And so this was also a way to activate non-traditional spaces to have cultural experiences and interactions in neighborhoods where residents live. One of the big components about the program, as you see, is that it is free for all participants. That was a way to remove and eliminate one of the barriers that was expressed by the residents. Next slide. And so as you will see here, the map on the left is the current map of culture blocks. So culture blocks takes place in now 10 designated geographies across the county. And so you can see the map on the right was the map that shows the results of that survey. So looking at trying to find ways to be intentional about delivering cultural experiences into communities, in neighborhoods, sometimes that were historically excluded, sometimes where spaces didn't exist, where cultural experiences were taking place. Next slide. So how does the program work? So I mentioned that it is rooted in community neighborhood feedback. And we get this feedback by hosting community meals prior to the pandemic. We had what we call community meals in person in each of the 10 designated blocks, because everybody has different desires and preferences, right? And so for us, what's really important is working with community and not doing to community. And so just because something is free doesn't mean that it is of interest to people. So we want to know what types of cultural experiences and interactions do people want to have. And so we get this information at the community meals. We host facilitated discussions to find out from the neighbors, what they would like to have happen. We also collect this information by way of virtual block parties. Because of the pandemic, right, we're not able to gather in person. And so we simulated these community meals. We had pre-recorded performances to give people a perspective of what culture blocks looks like. We also send surveys to neighborhood associations. We're able to get that information from the city of Charlotte and send out surveys for residents to complete, to let us know what they would like to see have happen in their respective communities. And because of the funding that we receive from the county, we are able to fund creative individuals and organizations to do this great work in these programs. And so it is a fee for service in that we pay for the community facing aspect of the programs. Next slide. So this is just a snapshot of what, again, when we were hosting programs in the community meals in person, we would have feedback forms on the tables. And as you see, one of our younger neighbors completed this survey, and the picture just showed what the community meals looked like. Next slide. And so just to kind of give a perspective of where we started and where we are. So I mentioned the program actually started in 2016 with 5 geographic blocks, and now we have doubled in size to 10 designated geographies across Mecklenburg County. We have been able to reach over 138,000 participants by way of in-person as well as virtual performances and experiences. We have been able to activate numerous non-traditional spaces, across the county for these experiences to take place. We've been able to forge relationships with neighbors and neighborhood associations ensuring that we are meeting their needs, and as I like to say, giving the people what they want in terms of cultural interactions. In addition to providing cultural experiences, we're also able to help fund programs and experiences that meet and address several different issues and challenges across our community, as you can see here. So topics such as gentrification, health and wellness, making sure that we are meeting the needs of our neighbors in different age demographics. And the program continues to meet the needs of our neighbors. And so we're really excited to be featured as one of the programs in this study. So I will be available for questions. There will be a question and answer section a little bit later in the program, but I'm now going to turn this over to Tracy Knuckles, who's going to lead a wonderful discussion about data. Tracy.
Thanks, Ebony. That was a great case study. What a good example of inclusivity and access when it comes to the arts. We talk a lot about culture blocks. So now we're going to move our program into a discussion of arts data in practice and why it's important. And it's hard to think of two better people to talk about that with than our friends from Los Angeles County, Kristen Sakota and Bronwyn Malden. And as Ebony noted, after our panel, we'll open it up for questions to all of the presenters. So we encourage you to use the chat for that, and we'll do our best to get to your questions. So by way of introduction, Kristen Sakota is the director of the Los Angeles County Department of Arts and Culture, a local arts agency with a mission of advancing arts, culture, and creativity throughout the largest county in the US. Appointed by the LA County Board of Supervisors, it's been under her leadership that the organization made its historic transition from an arts commission into a full-fledged department for arts and culture, the first of its kind in the county. Ms. Sakota is an arts executive, attorney, and performing artist with more than 25 years in the field. And she's appeared on national and international stages, including with dance and social justice company Urban Bushwomen, and in musicals Rent and Mamma Mia on Broadway. And prior to her work in LA, she served in key leadership roles at the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, where many here at Bloomberg had the pleasure of working with her. Bronwyn Malden is the Director of Research and Evaluation at the LA County Department of Arts and Culture. There, she leads a team that utilizes data and research methods to strengthen the arts ecology and to ensure that all residents have equitable access to the arts. In her career conducting applied research and evaluation for nonprofits, philanthropies, and governments, Bronwyn launched the LA Annual Arts Datathon, evaluated farm worker programs, studied employment conditions for truck drivers, and researched villagers organizing in rural Northeast Thailand. What a career. Thank you both for being here. It's a pleasure to chat with you. So to kick us off, Kristen, I'm going to ask you to give a brief overview of the department, its reach, its funding, and generally its approach to data.
Happy to. And first, let me just quickly say thank you so much for inviting us to be here for this fantastic conversation and to be part of this incredible report. Thanks to everybody at Bloomberg, and of course, acknowledging also our colleagues at the NEA, including Ms. Maria Rosario Jackson, who is hailing from LA County and was even part of our LA County Cultural Equity and Inclusion Initiative, where she served as a prior co-chair. So loving you all, a big love coming from LA. And I'm here with a big smile and long auburn locks and wearing Diva purple, as well as Pantone's color of the year and my clear glasses. Okay. So yeah, I'm happy to talk about the department. Of course, we're a local arts agency serving LA County, as you said, the largest county in the US. And as all local arts agencies that I really believe we're all really rooted in and so reflective of and responsive to the jurisdiction where we are. For us, some of our core strategies and the way we're structured are to really bring forward support in grant making, as well as professional development for the field. Also, arts education. We lead one of the largest public-private arts education collective impact models to advance equity and access in arts education, as well as civic art, our public art practice, where we're commissioning artists for county capital projects and beyond. And of course, our small but mighty research and evaluation team you're going to hear about today. And we newly have a cross-sector arts manager who's helping to lead some of our additional work as we think about the role of the arts across different sectors of civic life. And all of this, of course, is supported, by a broader team with admin and communications, and creative career pathways as another focus amongst many of these programs, including the LA County Arts Internship Program. So in all of that, I just want to highlight one other data point. Just like when I came here from New York, and I had lots of familiarity with Los Angeles, my sister had lived here for 15 years, I'd been here, my husband's from here, etc. But actually, it was the data point and the lived experience, but that helped me put it into perspective and how I understand the landscape. So New York City is super diverse. 8.5 million people, over 200 languages spoken in, I think, about 300 or 400 square miles. Los Angeles County is 10 million people, extremely diverse people, over 200 languages spoken, and it's situated in 4,000 square miles. So the geography itself plays an outsized role in how we think about access to the arts and how we think about the diversity of our communities, even in terms of rural, beach communities, urban, suburban. And so that's just literally one way that, like, one data point helps me be like, wow, y'all. And when I talk to other people from New York, they get it when I give them that data point. So just highlighting that, and I'll kick it back to you.
Well, LA County was unique then in being among the first to create a position like Bronwyn's, Director of Research and Evaluation. And Bronwyn, we'd love to hear from you about what you do day to day, covering all of that territory in Los Angeles.
Well, thank you, Tracy, and thank you, everybody. It's fantastic to be here. It's funny. I kind of like to say that my job is to create 3 to 5 bullet points that my colleagues, my director, Kristen, or the people in the communities that we serve, that they can actually use to help them achieve their goals. Now, sometimes I can generate those couple of bullet points in a few hours, but sometimes it takes weeks and sometimes months. And there are some projects where it has taken years to collect data, analyze it, and then make it available in a format that's really easy to understand and actionable. Like, so people can really take action. They can say, aha, I get it. Let's go. We know what to do with that. My small team at the department, we use data and a variety of research methods to strengthen our work and to support the communities that we serve. The way it often works is that a colleague comes to me with a problem they're trying to solve. They need information and they're like, help me get the information. Sometimes they come to me and say, I'm going to do a survey. And I say, hang on, is a survey really the best way to get what you need? Let's find out if there's some administrative data already available. Let's see if we do a lit review. Let's find out, so we talk through what's the problem they're solving, what's the information they need. And then I go to help them to figure out what kind of data may already be available, what new data we need to collect, what's the best way to collect it. And then we're also from the very front end thinking about what's the most effective way to report out what we learn, because the data isn't the point, it's the action, it's what people do with the data that's the point. And that's what we're constantly thinking about. I want to throw out just a couple of examples of things we've done in recent years. We've got the Arts Ed Profile, where we gather data about the quantity and quality of arts education in all 2,000 plus schools in 81 school districts in the county, and we make it available in a public-facing interactive tool. We've done a study of earnings among entry-level arts administrators and how do they experience those earnings. We've done another study where we talk with arts audiences and participants to understand how do they incorporate arts and culture into their lives and why? Why do they care about the arts? And then we've done another study. We have an ongoing data collection project where we're tracking how our public art funds flow through the artists that we contract with to people who are working in a surprisingly wide range of jobs, from construction laborers to photographers to maintenance workers. And then I had to mention again the annual Arts Datathon, where we bring together the arts community every year to explore how can we use data to improve access to the arts for everyone who lives in LA County. Just a few examples of things we've done.
Great examples. So Kristen, these research studies that Bronwyn's creating, or even the 3 or 5 bullets that she's putting together, what are you doing with them? What's your number one use for this great data that she's mining for you?
Oh my God. Well, it is fantastic having Bronwyn. And she is very good at always keeping the practical in front of us and not kind of superfluous and not also overburdening the field. So we do believe strongly in the value of the data. And you know, I've been thinking about this, and it's almost hard for me to say the one way that I think I'm using it the most, but I'm thinking of about 3 things, really thinking about how we're using data to inform policy, program, and decision making. Thinking about data essentially to track or better understand equity and field needs, and also creating original research reports and utilizing the data collection as a resource and knowledge building for the field. They're produced and disseminated to the field. And finally, of course, we use data to make the case. Got to use data to make the case. And so these are things that, you know, I would be harder. It would be harder to do without data of any kind, first of all. But then having a Bronwyn in-house who can either find it out there if I haven't come across a fabulous report from Bloomberg or wherever we got it, or to lead data collection efforts for us, as well as in partnership with the other cities and the other local arts agencies in our region.
That's great. So I'm sure all this data is not without its challenges, though. I'd love to ask the both of you what challenges you've encountered with data collection and where from. And if you've had those challenges, how have you tried to respond to them?
You want to start?
Kristen, you want to start that, or I will?
Either way, I'll start with one, which is kind of a perennial. It's always, of course, I think a question of, you know, we don't want to overburden arts organizations or other folks. And so what's sort of the burden and the benefit, and how do we well tailor what we need? So that, I think, you know, is sort of a common one that we, of course, experience as well. But so much of the incredible data that we're able to do, we wouldn't know if we hadn't been either tracking it internally ourselves, or if we hadn't gone out and asked for it. And so even just a couple of simple examples about tracking data and trying to do it as seamlessly as possible. So first of all, there's just the data we would have, right, of our own grantees, like where they are, et cetera. And I use that occasionally internally, just so I get a sense of what we're doing in our program, what's our impact. It's how that I know the landscape in LA, that the hundreds of organizations we support, like 98% of them have a budget of less than $10 million. That's actually the bulk of who we're serving. That helps me greatly to understand what we're dealing with. It's also how I know that about 89% of the dollars in our flagship grants are going to those organizations. So we are tracking and ensuring that we're not skewing or essentially reinforcing the dynamic nationwide where large, often Eurocentric organizations get all the funding. We're not doing that, actually. And so I know that, and I know that from the data. One other little example of trying to weave it in is last year. Was it last year? Oh my God, was it 2020 or 2021 when we had the CARES Act? And we were able to advocate what I always like to call the inside advocacy to get a $10 million allocation to do a CARES Act Arts Relief Fund. Our team brilliantly wove into an extremely simplified application some questions about what the organizations had experienced, what kind of losses due to COVID or unanticipated impacts, how they plan to use the money, et cetera. With that information, we learned that the over 300 organizations that applied to us combined had an aggregate losses and unanticipated expenses of over $200 million. So that allowed us to push our 10 million allocation. We ended up getting 2 more, turned it into 12, and then later justify a new allocation of American Rescue Plan dollars from the county to us for 22 million to support new creative recovery efforts going forward. If we hadn't asked the questions, we wouldn't have had that justification. We would have gone on our gut on what we're hearing, but it was those numbers as well as the numbers from, you know, Americans for the Arts, et cetera, that Bronwyn was dutifully tracking that really helped us make that case.
Right, I think those are great examples, Kristen. I'm going to get a little bit wonky here. I'll be the data nerd. and talk about one of the other interesting challenges that I think might be really relevant to a lot of folks who are watching the webinar, is administrative data sets, that data that already exists, and how do we deploy that effectively? How can we, best use it, and kind of coming to terms with the limitations of those data sets. I'm going to give you two really very clear examples that that we work with. Let's ask the question: how many arts nonprofits are there in LA County? That should be a thing that is a finite number that should be countable. Well, the answer, of course, is it depends on where you look. Two places you might look. We work very closely with SMU Data Arts. We've got tons of really great detailed data on those grantees that are in the SMU Data Arts data set. And the number there, I think from 2019, the most recent year available that we have a full year for, there's something on the order of 480 arts nonprofits on which we have tremendous, really great detailed information we can dig into and find out a lot about the nature of what's happening in the arts community. If you go to the IRS and ask and look for the number of how many nonprofit organizations are there in LA County that are coded, I have an NTEE code, Arts, Culture, and Humanities, it's over 5,000 organizations. Those are arts nonprofits too, except depending on what you're looking for, you might go to one or the other of those sources. Our grantees include organizations that are NTEE arts, have that code at the IRS, but our grantee, that's not an eligibility requirement. So we have grantees that do arts, but they're coded by the IRS as something else. And there's a lot of organizations in that NTEE code that would not necessarily be eligible for our grants based on their mission. So, when you're asking a question, and I always want to find out, is there data to answer that question somewhere? Does it exist outside already? And can I just get access to it and download it? It also depends, you have to really carefully choose. And sometimes you're looking at proxies for what's a close enough answer to the question you're asking.
Well, Bronwyn, it's great that LA County has you as a resource, but we have many listeners here from smaller cities. They don't have a data evaluator or analyst. And there was one mention in the chat, it sounds like this is a costly endeavor that requires money for consultants. So what tips would you give to smaller cities around data collection and analysis? What's important? What's really practical for them to take on?
Yeah, a couple of things I would say off the top is, first off, make friends with other city, county departments. You may have access to, let's say, GIS services from them, or there may be some data. For a while, some years back, there's an annual biennial survey that the Department of Public Health does of residents across the county. And we were able to add a couple of arts related questions. So, look at those resources and make friends and see what opportunities there might be for data collection. As I said, always look for what administrative, we use census data all the time, IRS data where it makes sense. Go to the NEA, they've got resources available. Lit reviews, sometimes the question you're asking, there may be an answer in the literature or something close enough so you can get a sense. Like if you want to find out about impact of arts education, that's a field that has, very robust literature. You might not need, if you're making the case for investment in arts education, you might not need to do original research. It might be that citations of existing literature may give you what you need. And then also, there's the Cultural Research Network that I'd encourage anyone who's interested to join. I've been part of it for years, and that is a network of colleagues who all care about arts data, and it's the most collegial group of folks, and it's mostly a listserv and some webinars that are great. And then the last thing I would say is look to your own staff and think about who might be your accidental data people. Before I joined the department in 2013, we had a couple of people on staff who just kind of had a natural inclination to who like data, who like spreadsheets, who like analyzing things, and think about how they might be utilized and those skill sets deployed.
Great advice. Well, with that, I want to make sure we have time for questions. I'm going to invite Ebony and David to join us and invite more questions from the audience in the few minutes we have left. Actually, David, we have a good question for you. It seems like the research output are mostly quantitative. One of the challenges we have is to create research both quantitative and qualitative. I'm sure you agree that in the arts, it's important to show stats and stories, facts and feelings. Can you share learnings on best research methodology to obtain both quant and qual?
Yeah, so that has come up time and time again. And I think, this report comes out because there is a reliance sometimes on the qualitative information and narrative information in the arts and not so much on the quantitative. But the reality is that you need both in order to tell the full story. And some of the qualitative data can be quantified. So for example, the public perception of a particular space after there's a public art installation has been put in. You can survey people walking by beforehand and survey afterward and tally up, their perception, how positively they felt towards the space, and see if there's a shift. So that's one thing you can do. But also you can pair the data that you're seeing with things like testimonials or narratives or examples that you've gone out and culled from community conversations to tell a more rounded and compelling story. And I don't know if anyone from LA or Charlotte teams have any good examples they'd want to share.
I just wanted to offer, maybe not necessarily an example, but this is something I kind of think a lot about. I'm going to take it not just from sort of quantitative, qualitative, but actually the ways that we can utilize data or fall into traps of having data actually reinforce narratives that we actually are trying to undo in terms of equity. So obviously, one of the, what I like to call equity principles for action, is to use data disaggregated by race and other factors to actually assess who's got what, where is money going, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also extremely important to me, the narrative and the way we frame those discussions. We once had a presentation where we invited someone to speak on a very important study about sort of advantage and disadvantage in LA. And I'll be honest, the way the person was talking was like, and the Black community continues to lack in this and not achieve that and whatever. I ain't doing that. The framing is just, and the naming is just as important as the numbers. I remember in college taking statistics, and I feel like what I walked away with was, then yeah, the numbers don't lie, but you can frame them any kind of way to tell any kind of story you want. To me, that is, as a leader, that is critical, that we are thinking about the naming and the framing and giving agency. Whose story are we telling? What race and ethnicity, what cultures are we uplifting in the case studies, in the photos? Whose voice gets privilege? And Bronwyn has been great about blending both quantitative and qualitative interviews. And I think we continue to have a journey before us as well to keep getting better and better and sharper.
Awesome, awesome. So there are two questions. I'm going to combine them because I think they're related. There was one earlier in the chat that says, how do we encourage funded programs to be purposeful in their data collection that supports their funding needs? How do we simplify? And related to this, we don't want grantees to spend countless hours submitting data, just for, the county's use. We want it to be put to real action. So how about Bronwyn? Do you want to take a pass at that?
The way I always approach this is to work backwards from the goal. Like, what is it we need? What is we need the information for? Do we need this data for program management? Do we need it for advocacy with our authorizers to make the case? Or is there some other story we're trying to tell? And then work backwards from that to try and ask, well, what's the exact data that's going to give us the things that we need in order, whether it's to do the math or to tell the stories. And I'll go back to the example the thing that we struggle with all the time, this question of demographics and the problematics of census categories. One of the ways we've tackled that is to actually do two questions. We've got to be able to compare the people we serve to the population as a whole. So we're trapped inside of those deeply problematic census categories. So we add a second question where we invite people to write in their own words. How do you identify? And so we ask the same question twice, recognizing that doing that kind of analysis of those open-ended questions, we get all sorts of fascinating responses, learn a lot from them. And so doing both, I think, really deepens our understanding and helps us to tell a more complex story than limiting ourselves to census categories.
Right, creative data gathering. And I want to ask Ebony to weigh in here, because it sounds like your community meals were the way that you gathered data to build culture blocks.
Absolutely. And we also utilize feedback that we receive from participants about their experience when we're having conversations with the county, because I mentioned the county funds the program. And so when it's that time of the year for us to go ask for more funding or continued funding, right? While we're able to share the number of events and experiences and participants, we also rely heavily on that feedback from participants. So for example, there was a program this past year, and of course, because of COVID, we have made some adjustments to how programs are delivered. So the majority were delivered, or all were delivered virtually at one point. And so what we found was that we were able to reach some neighbors who had not been able to be reached before. So for those neighbors who maybe are homebound or have very difficult times getting out of their homes, for those neighbors, as well as for some of our neighbors who might have some limited abilities. And there was a participant who shared her experience at a county commission meeting, and that sharing led one of the county commissioners in particular to set aside some additional funding specifically for us culture blocks to work with our therapeutic recreation department through Parks and Recs to have some programming specifically for some of our neighbors who do have limited physical abilities. And so again, going back to the point about, numbers are great, but also the stories and actually hearing about the impact from our neighbors in terms of how they're impacted definitely goes a long way.
Great. Bronwyn, I'm going to ask you one last question before we close out from the chat. How do we work with existing data sets? Chicago has a robust data collection system, such as GIS, but how do we go beyond the numbers to better serve our neighbors and residents?
There's really kind of two different ways I kind of approach that. One of them is when I've got a problem to solve, I start looking for those data sets. So think about, starting from what's the problem, what's the information you need, where's the data to answer that. The other thing now, and if I had more time, if we all had more time, to get access to a data set that I think is probably interesting and do a little playing around with it, maybe on a Friday afternoon, I've got 2 hours I could set aside to just dig into a data set. There's so much more. You guys, we are surrounded by data. We are rich with data. We are overwhelmed by data all day long. And when you are trying to figure out what should I spend my time on, I'm always going to go back to that question of what do I need to do? I think of this in terms of also like, how do I reduce data collection from grantees or contractors? Well, ask myself, or I ask my colleagues actually, if you got data about this facet of the program, would you actually change it? Or are we actually obligated to keep it the way it is? Well, if we can't change it, why would we ask about it? Like, let's just save our time and energy. So that, I mean, I keep going back to the practicalities of what do I need to get done today, tomorrow, next week, and look for the data that helps me do that.
Great way to end. I want to thank all of our participants and panelists for joining. Thank you in the audience for joining. I feel like 60 minutes isn't enough for this, but there's more. Download the guide. We will provide the link in the chat again. You can even sign up to get a handy dandy paper copy. It's in your backpack, it's in your purse, take it along. And you can also download a great podcast that David was a part of explaining more about the guide. Thank you again for your attention. Keep in touch with us. Tell us your data stories because more arts, everybody wins. Thanks.